So we've got some people trickling in. We'll give them a few minutes to do that. But in the meantime, thought I'd just tee up the conversation. Connor, thanks for joining us today. My name's Asif. I'm a co-founder of OfficeHours here. We do one-on-one coaching for buy-side prep and investment banking prep. Really excited about the conversation here today. I'm joined by Connor Wasz, and I'll let him introduce himself. But as a quick background, Connor and I both did investment banking in the industrials group at Wells Fargo, I guess 7 years ago, which is crazy to think about. And since then, we've both gone to do private equity and beyond. So, wanted to touch on breaking into banking today, breaking into private equity, considerations about business school, and a lot more. So in terms of the conversation, we'll structure it as a 30-minute Q&A between Connor and myself, and then we'll open the floor to questions for the last 15 minutes or so. If at any time anyone in the audience has questions, feel free to put it in the chat. But otherwise, Connor, should we get kicked off?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to provide some more context on my background if you want me to start there.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Sweet. So before joining Asif in the Wells Fargo Industrials team in New York, I was an undergraduate student at the University of Arizona, which I doubt we have too many U of A students on the call today. It's not very well-known school in terms of placement on the street and for both banking and private equity. So it was an uphill battle to climb for me to kind of break in, combined with the fact that I developed the interest very late in the game. And so I was actually doing an internship at Bank of America, that pivotal summer going into my senior year, but it was not on the banking side. It was on the, investment management side, which, not a whole lot of connectivity there to the investment bank. So that summer I had to kind of navigate the full-time recruiting process, did a ton of, cold networking, cold outreach, self-study, went online and, look after any resource I could find. Obviously OfficeHours wasn't a thing back then, but successfully navigated the, full-time recruiting process, ended up with a couple of offers, but Wells Fargo Industrials team in New York was the one that I went with. I'm happy to kind of go into further detail there. But just like a lot of other folks getting into banking, I was kind of using that as a platform to get to the next opportunity. Wasn't 100% sure on where that was going to be. Always knew I was interested in an investing role. And, a lot of my experience at Wells was with, middle market M&A, and kind of, that experience combined with, my background not being, like a top tier, I wasn't going to go for, mega funds given my, non-target undergraduate program. Wells Fargo, I definitely learned a lot, but it's a little bit harder to navigate the recruiting process compared to some other banks out there. But I did recruit in my first year, pursued mostly middle market private equity, casted a wide net, everywhere from New York to Chicago to West Coast. An interview opportunity came up with HIG Capital in their Miami office, and I was pretty open to that idea. I knew of them as a great firm, and so that was the one that ended up working out for me for a number of reasons. And then so that was my next step for me. Took that offer during the on-cycle process in my first year, which was great to have that kind of figured out. I had a year and a half left in the banking job. So popped down to Miami, spent a couple of years on the middle market private equity team as a generalist associate. And then for my third year, I actually ended up staying on board, but took on a role with one of our portfolio companies, which brought me out to the West Coast. And so kind of a traditional 2 years banking, 2 years private equity with, a few years of operating thrown in there. And then during the operating role, I also applied to business school. And starting in August, I'll be heading to Wharton to pursue my full-time MBA.
Awesome. Really great background. And honestly, if you look at the trajectory of where you started at University of Arizona to where you've ended up at Wharton after, working on some great shops, you've really kind of not only level set the trajectory compared to peers who might have started at target schools, but you've kind of surpassed a lot of them too, which is really impressive. And I wanted to go into that trajectory and the strategic moves you made, because it certainly wasn't easy any step of the way. So maybe if we could start with recruiting for investment banking from Arizona, what advice would you have for people recruiting from non-target schools? Because for me, I went to Duke, all the banks came to campus. We had a week where we were just interviewing for hours every day, and then people had their offers. So how did you go about it, and how did you end up at Wells?
Yeah, absolutely. So, any non-target applicant is going to be battling against the fact that there's not going to be a ton, if any, on-campus investment banking recruiting. So if I were to go back, I definitely would have tried to kind of figure out that that's the path I was going to be going down sooner, as opposed to, going into senior year and kind of hustling last minute. The earlier you can get started, the better, especially in terms of networking, prepping for those interviews, et cetera. But regardless of when you get started, networking is going to be a huge component of that. You kind of have to do everything on your own in terms of getting looks from different investment banks. So, I basically took the approach of went to LinkedIn, sent out a bunch of cold requests, sent out a bunch of cold emails, literally hundreds a week, during that summer. I was also doing an internship in Chicago. So I set up coffee chats in person as much as possible. And that's actually the two offers that I got from investment banks kind of came out of in-person meetings that I set up that summer. One was a Chicago-based bank, and then the other was, Wells Fargo Industrials team, New York, but I got introduced to some of their bankers in Chicago. So I'd say the earlier you can get started, the better. But regardless, don't be afraid to send out cold emails, utilize your own alumni network and, personal network as much as you can. But once that's tapped out, which for me happened pretty quickly, it just went the cold email approach. And it came down to a numbers game. Like if I reached out to, say 100 people in 1 week, I would maybe have conversations with, a quarter of them. And then, even less than that would lead to actual something relevant, like them asking for my resume or, getting me an interview, things like that. And then always approaching things with the mindset of looking to learn as opposed to hey, here's my resume. Are you guys hiring? I always found that taking the mindset of just, being open to different learning opportunities, pick people's brains, always ended up in, more favorable relationships that led to, eventual interviews and then eventually offers.
Totally. I want to emphasize two things here. One is the volume approach. It truly is a numbers-based game. A lot of mentees on our platform will say, hey, maybe I email 5 people. Maybe that'll convert into a job offer. And we constantly say, you need to email 100 people a week. The conversion rate, the response rate to your emails, you got to assume is 10% or less. And if you email 100 people, maybe you'll get 10 responses. And how many of those 10 people can you get on a phone call? You go down the filter of email to phone call to job opportunity. It ends up being around 500 people you probably need to email to get anything meaningful. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would totally agree. The more, the better, especially when you're battling against things like a non-target background or maybe a lower GPA. So when you have some of these things that are more check the box type things and you just don't check those boxes, the harder you need to work and the more people you need to reach out to.
Right. And then eventually something will click, hopefully.
Yeah, exactly.
I also like what you said about leading with authenticity. People know why you're reaching out. When you reach out to investment bankers, they know you're looking for a career. But it still is a little bit of a song and dance where you should be curious. You should be asking questions. People want to see that, hey, you are someone who would be a good banker. And if you're a little too transactional, you get on the phone with people and you say, hey, are you guys hiring right off the get-go? Odds are you're not going to get a call back. And they want to see that you have the EQ to understand that that's not how you get a job. You develop relationships by being authentic, learning more about others, sharing more about yourself, and then eventually something should hit.
Yeah, and that's where, some of your own prep comes into play, coming prepared with good questions. After you kind of, are sending out hundreds of emails, you'll start to quickly get calls and meetings scheduled every day, and you'll get better and better at it. And it's kind of like a snowball effect when, you talk with one person, they refer you to the next, and then your network just, grows bigger and bigger. And so, I basically had a tracker of all the people I was communicating with, which quickly grew. I would be following up with them. Again, some conversations led to follow-ups being hey, send me a resume and I'll get it in the right hands. Others didn't lead to much, but, still keep in touch with some of these people today. And so whether you're going to be, looking to make the next move into private equity or whatever the case may be, chances are a lot of people you're connecting with are going to be making similar moves, themselves.
Awesome. That's great. So that's the jump from Arizona to banking. Networking is the name of the game, probably 80-90% of what it takes. And then when you get on the phone, you get to learn people, you got to make sure you can convert. And that all comes down to preparation, knowing your story, studying the technicals. But, it really is shots on goal.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's a mix. Some of those conversations literally turned into interviews where they were asking me technical questions to see if I was prepped. Others were more just conversational, natural. So it's, obviously there's a mix of personalities of, people you're going to be connecting with. So it's going to be, prepared.
Totally. Preparation's everything. So you've gone into this banking role. You're at Wells Fargo in New York. Awesome. How was the experience there, and how did it set you up for private equity recruiting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and obviously you had a very similar experience to myself, being in the same group, same team, same type of people. I'd say for the most part in our group, private equity placement wasn't too stellar. We definitely had a few each year, but I remember you being in the class above me. You got an offer. I think it was Morgenthaler, and you basically took, we went out to like grab coffee or lunch, and you're like, hey, I'm leaving. And I think you ended up even leaving early just based off of their preference. But I do remember, like, I was just starting out, and I remember, like, you're amongst, one of a few people who were leaving for private equity. And then so that kind of, provided some inspiration for me to kind of get going. We talked a little bit about like what it entails in terms of the recruiting process, like the modeling tests, the technical questions, everything like that. So I did a lot of prep on my own, meaning like, learn to build an LBO model from scratch at Wells, as well as many other banks. You do modeling on the job, but in a coverage team, sometimes you're partnering with the M&A team, and like they'll be running the model. But also, even if I were to be, the analyst on a deal running things, everything's template based, and it's all about efficiency. So rarely did I ever do anything from scratch on the job. So when it came to that part of the private equity recruiting process, pretty much had to kind of learn how to do all those types of things on my own. Working with headhunters was obviously big, and I met with all the headhunters early on, and made sure that I kind of checked the box for each of them, and started to get opportunities from them. But I also knew that given my kind of non-target profile, Wells Fargo being, not amongst the top tier of banks, I knew that networking was going to continue to be important for me. So I played it both ways. I got plenty of interviews and super days through headhunters, but also had a handful of, especially with funds I was interested in. I had like a short list of firms, maybe like, 10 to 20 that I was proactively reaching out to. And some of those I was able to like bypass the headhunter. Or there were even cases where I connected with someone. They're like, hey, would love to get you an interview, but also like we pretty much run everything through our headhunter. So make sure you go meet with, this person at this headhunting firm, and, mention that we chatted. And then also like when I met with that headhunter, I, mentioned that conversation, and like, it basically guaranteed me an interview. So it was a mix of ways that I kind of broke into firms' processes. And then from there, it was just all about just like the banking interview, all came down to prep, and it was also a numbers game. I had several final rounds that did not go my way, but then when the one, final did end up being the best opportunity that I had anyway. Totally.
No, it really is a great outcome. And I think a couple of people ended up going to H.I.G from our group. So really nice connection here. I want to talk about the headhunters in this process, because by this point, we know there's about 10 to 15 headhunters that kind of control probably 95% of equity opportunities. And they are pretty mechanical about how they screen candidates, right? They'll go through their top list of banks. They'll look at your GPA. They'll look at your school. They'll even look at your group. And if you don't fall under, a certain number of banks or brands, then you're kind of out of luck. Like I remember I couldn't get some headhunters on the phone. Not that I understood how the process worked, but it was really challenging. Whereas a lot of my peers working at Goldman and Morgan Stanley, they're getting hit up by headhunters all the time. And you shouldn't give up at that point, right? You said you reached out directly to firms, which a lot of people don't know. People think for banking, you should network, but for private equity, networking is not useful. Can you talk more about networking in private equity for the role?
Yeah, for sure. I'd say, the reason that some people have that mindset is, networking into banking is definitely a little bit more common, just because, most of those candidates are undergraduate students, when networking is just even more crucial to kind of start building your network. And it's very common to break into banking. Private equity, it's definitely less common. I found that response rates were generally lower, but also just based on number of spots available and number of people working in private equity, the pool of folks to reach out to is just a lot smaller. So I think that's why some people are hesitant to take the networking approach. But my approach was early on, when I decided I was going to go through with, on-cycle private equity recruiting, I had a list of, like I said before, 10 to 20 firms that I wanted to do whatever I could to get an interview. So some of that meant, using referrals or, people that I knew either from Wells or, other contacts that I had at those firms. So use any, network I already had, but also wasn't afraid to, cold outreach. And again, taking the same approach of looking to learn, and not necessarily just being aggressive about, are you guys hiring? When is the process kicking off? How can I, best prepare? It was more like, hey, I'm trying to figure out what types of funds I might be interested in. Your guys' strategy is interesting for these reasons, or I came across this portfolio company, or I worked on a similar deal, or maybe even worked on a deal in that private equity firm was a part of. And then you kind of use that as your in to try to learn some more and get a feel for yourself. If like, okay, is this a good firm for me? Is it a good culture fit? Do I like the people? Things like that. So yeah, I mean, I'd say a lot of my interviews were through headhunters, but ultimately the offer I got from H.I.G. was just based on, proactive networking and some contacts that I had there, even including yourself, Asif.
Nice. I love to hear it. So should we talk a little bit about H.I.G, their firm strategy, why you ended up picking H.I.G? Because you mentioned you interviewed at a number of places, and H.I.G. is one of the fastest growing and now like one of the largest AUMs out there. So they've grown quite a bit in recent. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what I was looking for was a number of things, but I'd say the number one was the learning opportunity associated with a private equity role, similar to how I thought about going into banking straight out of undergrad. I think 2 years in banking positions you quite well for whatever your next step might be. I think after those 2 years, learning curve kind of flattens out a little bit. And I was ready to make a move and, climb the next learning curve. Where in private equity, you're not only kind of continuing the transactional oriented nature of the work, but also you're getting some insight into operations, strategy, portfolio management, things like that. So I was looking for, as an industrials banking analyst, I liked industrials, but I honestly chose it based on the group fit and the people that I met, as opposed to like that being like my industry of interest and where I wanted to specialize long term. So I actually wanted to get to generalist programs. H.I.G. pretty much looks at any given industry, and associates and VPs, even some principals, are generalists, and get to look at a number of different types of industries. I took on 3 portfolio companies. All 3 were in different industries. So I felt the learning opportunity there was definitely strong. It was an established firm. H.I.G.'s been around since the early 90s. And like you said, is one of the fastest growing. They're always launching new funds, new strategies, and AUM is, amongst the top in terms of, comparable firms out there. And so given that they're, established, return history has been phenomenal, I knew I was going to get a great experience, whether I, spent 2 years there, longer. I also heard about their kind of approach where they're big fans of getting our associates operating experience, which I was interested in going in. And that's ultimately the path that I ended up taking. So there's a number of reasons. I'd say Miami, I never really thought about living in, but that's their headquarters, and ended up being open to that idea. And Miami's probably been the favorite place that I've lived amongst, LA, New York, Chicago, and Miami, and very well would enjoy getting back there, post MBA.
Awesome. Great to hear it. When it comes to the private equity associate role, you're right. The role is divided into evaluating new investment opportunities and, making the models, going to investment committee, and coming up with a valuation on whether we should invest in this company or not. But apart from the investing, there's also a ton of portfolio company work. And I think a lot of different PE firms differ in the extent to which associates participate in portfolio companies. And my experience is, especially when I was in lower middle market private equity, it was pretty hands-on. I was going to portfolio companies maybe on a quarterly basis, maybe more. I knew the CEO and CFO on a first name basis. We would hop on the phone, we'd drive through financial initiatives and otherwise. But I found that at the larger firms, since I worked at both a really large firm and a smaller firm, the larger firms let the management team do their thing. And they kind of check in every now and then when they need to, and they're a capital provider, they help with add-ons, but it's really not as hands-on. So how was your experience in private equity working with the portcos? And then when you actually went to a portco full-time, how did that differ?
Yeah, I'd say in general, and H.I.G, by the way, which probably many people know, have multiple private equity investing vehicles. They have lower middle market. They have a middle market, which was what I was in. They have an advantage fund, which is a slightly different strategy, but similar sized businesses. And they recently launched tech fund, a infrastructure fund. But I'd say as a general statement, pretty heavily involved on the portfolio front. Typically every deal will tap into some operating executives that will help out. H.I.G not only has in-house operators, but also in-house recruiters and things like that, just given how big they are versus other firms maybe outsourcing a lot of those functions. So as an associate, and especially since I took on multiple portfolio companies, there were some weeks when my work was, 60% portfolio, 40% new deals. Other weeks, it could have been, if a new deal got busy in later stage, that kind of split would shift a little bit. But similar to yourself, I'd say, ongoing stuff. H.I.G takes the buy and build approach quite often. So the private equity team will kind of take lead on evaluating those add-on investments. Organic growth initiatives, we also will play a big role in. It also depends on the company. When things are going well and the company's growing, hitting their numbers, it's a little bit easier to take the hands-off approach. When things aren't going so well, I worked on a couple of restructurings during my time with one of my portfolio companies, and that's when things get, especially busy on the portfolio front. So it's a range of things. I also, during my second year is when COVID hit, and we shifted to doing weekly portfolio reviews, as I'm sure many other private equity firms started to do. So definitely a mix, but I'd say general statement, they're pretty heavily involved on the portfolio front, but always depends on the deal, what's going on, if it's going well, whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, got more involved when things go wrong, for sure. And when things are going smoothly, you let it ride. When you ended up, you did 3 years of investing at H.I.G, and then you went to a portfolio company, and you've been there full-time for a year, right?
I did 2 years on the middle market private equity team, and I'm just about to wrap up my second year on the portfolio front. That third year, there was kind of a little bit of overlap into continuing some investing stuff with the portco role. So it was kind of a 2 years banking, 2 years PE, 2 years operating, and then 2 years business school. So very big on the 2-year approach to things.
Got it. So how did that experience differ when you were working at the portco full time? What did you learn that you didn't learn when you were at arm's length working at H.I.G?
Yeah. And again, this is an approach that several other associates have taken in the past from H.I.G, and some other private equity firms out there also have similar programs like this. And so it's always dependent on the business and what the role entails. So I actually met with a few different portfolio companies and talked about what that role might look like. Ended up coming out to Los Angeles to join this business, Digital Room, which is a custom print company focused on small to medium-sized businesses. Basically, that shirt you're wearing right now would be like a perfect product that we offer, like a custom designed, polo selling business to business. And they have multiple product categories. And when I first came on board, there wasn't really a ton of leadership for each product category. So the main role I took on was leading one of the business categories, but also just given the banking private equity background, helped out quite a bit on corporate development initiatives, strategy stuff. We also launched the sale process right around that 1 year point of when I got involved. So a lot of the work started to look a little bit more, the traditional private equity stuff, but it's been a mix of stuff. I'd say, for the most part, I stepped into a role where, some of my peers and the other category directors or the other, heads of business units, they came in with a ton of experience, much more than myself. And a lot of them were former CEOs of their business, and Digital Room went out and acquired them, brought them on board, and, took them from CEO to heads of those business units. So it was definitely lacking in terms of relevant experience there. But what I kind of made up with was the analytical mindset, being able to kind of take a data-driven approach to growth initiatives and things like that. And then naturally was able to help out with add-on acquisition, sale process, things like that. So it's looked very different overall from banking private equity, but I think that's been a positive. Mm-hmm. And the idea is to probably use this operating experience to get back to the, investing side of things post MBA, but now kind of having a different lens to see things through now with kind of the operational and leadership experience.
Yeah. I think there's no doubt that operating experience makes you a better investor. It allows you to empathize with your portfolio company management teams a lot better. And it allows you to realize that there is so much day-to-day blocking and tackling running a business versus when you're investing, you're just getting numbers maybe every month, maybe every quarter, seeing what happened. But there really is so much going on, whether it's on a factory floor or on the engineering side of things. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I took on this role was just because kind of that general manager type position. I knew I was going to get exposure to all different aspects of the business. Still involved on the finance side, but also just heavy into, production operations. Most of what we do is e-commerce based. So, digital marketing and things like that. It's been super interesting. And then the role, I've been reporting directly to our CEO, work very closely with each of the executives. And then also just given I came on board from H.I.G, while they still owned it, had kind of direct access to the board, and then saw how things kind of changed when a new private equity firm came in, bought us out, and kind of saw a change in what the board looked like, how they kind of approach things differently than H.I.G. So yeah, overall it's definitely been a very solid way to kind of finish off the pre-MBA work experience.
Totally. And that's one of the benefits of being in private equity. I don't think there's another seat where as a young 20 something, mid 20 something, you have direct access to the CEOs and management teams. You have direct access to the board of directors, and you're actually involved at these board level decisions. I don't think there's any other seat that gives you exposure to all of the above. So it really is a way to accelerate your career and become this kind of all around toolkit, corporate general type person. So you have these skills, right? You have banking skills, you have the investing skills, you have the operational skills. What do you need the MBA for?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. Another reason I was actually interested in the operating role was to better position myself for, a top MBA rather than, just taking the tiers banking, tiers PE, which is obviously very common for pre-MBA folks who end up going to a top school, but it's just such an overpopulated field these days that anything you can do to differentiate yourself will give you will be a benefit. So, but main reason for me, one, I've always been, having this non-target stamp on my resume. And so I see I only applied to the top 3 schools, and, I took the approach of okay, if I don't go to one of these, I don't need to go, and I can just continue along the trajectory that I'm on. But if I do get in, it kind of gives me a further stamp of validation combined with the pre-MBA work experience should lead to some pretty interesting opportunities, 2 years down the road. Obviously sacrificing a little bit in the short term for the longer term benefits. But so that's part of it. And then also just 6 years in, just as a lot of other private equity guys kind of approach it, take a little bit of time to kind of take a step back and figure out do I want to have a long-term career in private equity? Is there another area of investing that I'm interested in? Do I want to get back to operations someday? Do I want to start a business? So that's another thing. I'd say those are kind of the main reasons. And getting into one of those schools, it was hard to turn down.
Totally. No, I mean, congratulations again. Wharton's phenomenal school. And, for me, when I was evaluating whether to go to an MBA or not, it came down to a few things, right? Like, number one, if I wanted to switch industries, get out of investing, go work at a tech startup, I think 2 years to have some pre-MBA internships, summer MBA internships, during the school year internships, it gives you more exposure to different roles. So if you're looking to switch your careers, it's a great place to do that while getting the credibility of an Ivy League school, right? But two, it's the brand building and the networking. There's a lot of investors where your fund will kick you out and make you go get an MBA before you have the opportunity to go back. And they want you to know all the consultants and all the bankers who are at your business school because they want you to have a Rolodex of people to call when you're doing deals. Say you're evaluating a health tech company, you go to Wharton. Wharton has a huge kind of healthcare MBA cross program, right? I had a few friends do that. And, say they go and end up working in healthcare consulting at McKinsey. You have someone you went to school with for 2 years, very well. You can give them a ring and say, hey, we're doing this due diligence. Do you guys have a team for us? Very useful in that end. And then if you're raising a fund, super useful too. All the future LPs and titans of industry are going to these schools. So it's not a bad look. Yeah, there are a lot of PE firms out there that still require it these days. I mean, there are plenty of
firms that are letting you bypass that, particularly if you're a top performer. H.I.G. kind of was a structured 2-year program. I was, I'd say, lucky to kind of extend that a couple of years and get the operating experience. But definitely they've been supportive for the B school route. Had several recommenders from H.I.G., so they were very helpful with that. And then Wharton, they've placed pretty well, and so I think things helped there. And the network is one of the things I'm most excited about. Kind of so far I've taken like the proactive approach of networking, which I'll continue to do, but it'll be a little bit easier when you have the common connection of that business school on your resume.
Totally. And even being a student, I feel like people respond to emails a little bit more frequently. You're coming from a place of learning versus if you're a professional,
yep.
Maybe it's a little bit more transactional, but I feel like people are more inclined to respond to students when you're networking.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. That's great. Well, that's a great 30-minute conversation, Connor. I have so many more questions for you, and we could talk all day, but wanted to open it up to the floor in case anyone had questions. Feel free to throw them in the chat or use the Q&A feature here on Zoom. Have a couple of questions already. One was from Adam. How do you balance studying for the GMAT while working full-time? That's a good question.
Yeah, good question. My GMAT journey started pretty early. I was studying for it a bit during undergrad because I knew, once I had the banking offer, like going into senior year, basically after I did all of that, spent that whole summer, networking, interviewing. So I had my senior year, and part of me was like, okay, let's use some downtime and start for the GMAT. I ended up taking it once. I didn't get a score that I wanted, and I was like, okay, I'm wasting my senior year. Like, I'll just find another time to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Then fast forward a couple of years, I had the offer, the private equity offer, like 6 months into my first year in banking, and I was already spending so much downtime prepping for recruiting that I just kind of took that time and allocated it towards the GMAT. So basically it was like sometimes early mornings, sometimes late nights, sometimes weekends. In my final few weeks of prep, I took a class from Manhattan Prep since I was in New York, and I ended up taking it I think 2 or 3 times, and then got the score that would check those schools' boxes. So yeah, I mean, it's just about finding downtime. Anything that's important to you, you can make work, but it definitely wasn't easy, working banking hours and studying. But given that I had a kind of a long-term horizon on applying to business school, I wasn't applying that year. So kind of dragging my process on longer than maybe most would, just because some days I wasn't able to study at all, or even some weeks, just depending on how work went.
Got it. When I studied for the GMAT, people recommended 50 hours of prep time, and I did end up taking it a couple of times until I got the score. Thinking about the GMAT is you get your score immediately after taking the test. There's no wait time.
Yeah.
If you don't like your score, you can cancel it. So take it as many times as you can. Another interesting point you brought up about differentiating your background when applying to business school by getting the operating experience. I didn't run the numbers for Wharton. I'd be interested to hear what percentage of the student body came from private equity, but we did run the numbers for Harvard Business School. And, of their class size, about 1,100 people, I think 120 of them came from private equity. So let's call, 10 to 12%. And I think that number's been going down over time, which is interesting. And there's more and more of a focus on diverse backgrounds and perspectives. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge push for all business schools, diversity and inclusion. Wharton, I think last year for the first time ever had a majority of its class female. It was 53% female. And so, all these top schools and really any business school, it's becoming important. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I'd probably put it somewhere around there for Wharton, maybe a little bit more than HBS from a finance background. Just Wharton's pretty much, known as, a top finance school. So they definitely accept a lot of people from banking, private equity, hedge funds. But I don't have the number. I'd say to 15% maybe, but wouldn't be surprised if that is also trickling down. And that's also why it's so important. So if you come from those fields, you need something to differentiate yourself, whether it's taking an extra year, getting operating experience, starting your own business, doing some volunteer activity that's super impactful. There's a lot of different things you can do. And the earlier you kind of get going on that, the better. If you know you're going to be applying to business school in the coming years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Totally. It is a strategic move you could make to get differentiated experience. A lot of people used to think you get into private equity, a top 3 business school is on lock, but in reality, there are way more private equity associates out there than there are slots in business school at any given time. So you do have to differentiate your application.
And like I said, I applied to 3 schools, got an interview with one of them, and then didn't get in. And then the other one, I didn't even get an interview. So Wharton ended up being the one. So it's tough out there.
Yeah. More and more competitive every year. And that goes for anything, I think.
Yeah.
We have a really interesting question here from Nita. I think you see it in the chat, Connor, but I'll rephrase it for the audience. Her question is, she came from a non-target school. She's got a middle market private equity offer straight out of college. But are there any disadvantages to going straight into private equity without the banking experience? And what are the kind of pros and cons of directly into PE versus getting that 2 years of banking training first?
Yeah, I'd say depends a little bit on, what your longer term goals are. If you're set on private equity as a longer term career, you can make the argument that the earlier you get there, the better. If you're a little bit more uncertain on okay, maybe I'll pursue private equity, maybe I'll pursue, growth equity investing, maybe a hedge fund someday, investment banking is kind of the platform where you go in and you definitely grind for those 2 years, but therefore you learn a lot. And it's kind of a proven training ground for whether it's private equity recruiting, hedge fund, growth. So kind of depends on what your goals are. You see candidates from time to time go directly to a growth equity analyst role, which ends up being mostly sourcing. And the disadvantage there is they're missing out on all the technical experience, the modeling stuff, the financial analyses. So it depends on the firm you're going to and the strategy. But if you're going directly to a middle market private equity shop, that's definitely an impressive accomplishment. So would feel pretty good about that. And if you're interested in either growing with that firm or staying in private equity for the longer term, it's definitely not a bad place to be. I think investment banking is just the platform where firms are constantly hiring from. It's kind of a proven process around it where you meet with headhunters, you pursue a number of opportunities. So depending on what your goals are, if you hate banking and you want to get straight to private equity, a lot of benefits there too.
Yeah. My 2 cents on that is I do think banking is a phenomenal training ground just to put in your 10,000 hours into Excel, PowerPoint, working with broad teams and understanding how to be a good worker, right? Like working and reporting to an associate, VP, MD, working in cross-functional teams, M&A, left fin versus industry groups. But I do think you hit the learning curve, as you mentioned. And some people hit the learning curve in 2 years, others hit it in 1 year. I felt like I hit it within my first year and decided it was time to go. But I'm really glad that I did it because, now I know people like you, Connor, and my alumni network from Wells Fargo is the hundreds of people versus if you go to a smaller PE shop, you don't have them. That being said, I think more and more private equity firms are starting analyst programs and hiring directly from undergrad. I know Bain Capital does it a lot. KKR started one. Insight, General Atlantic, Warburg, they all hire analysts now. And the rationale there is they think in some bankers, they develop really bad habits and they want to get you early directly from school. They want to teach you how to think before you have these bad habits. And that's why they are hiring more and more analysts. So I think there's pros and cons of both approach.
Yeah, I think the trend of hiring earlier and earlier is just starting to even make its way into the undergraduate pool as opposed to recruiting these banking analysts when they have, maybe a couple months of work experience and just training them themselves. So yeah, it seems to be a trend that's continuing. And then, but yeah, like you said, there's always gonna be benefits of, the 2 years of banking as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We have another question from Will. Hey, Will, what is one thing or a few things you wished you knew or prepped before PE recruiting? Were there certain questions that you wished you prepped for and maybe got stumped on? That's an interesting question.
My first ever interview for private equity was basically on week 1 of recruiting where all the mega funds were kicking off. And then a few upper middle market firms quickly followed. My first ever interview was in that first week with a firm named L. Catterton up in Greenwich, Connecticut. That was an example where I said before, that's a firm that uses the same headhunter pretty much every year. They have that relationship, so everything's going to be driven through them. I had a contact who was, a top performer at L. Catterton. They basically got into HBS. They basically gave him the option: you could go, you could come back, you don't have to go. So I had a really awesome contact there, and he kind of got me into the process, but also was like, meet with this headhunter. Went into the super day, nailed like every like live interview. The one challenging aspect of it was they hire a lot of consultants, and they gave me like a literal consulting case study that I was not prepared for at all. But luckily, the person was kind of nice and helped me out a little bit, and I kind of just took my best shot at it, and it ended up going okay. So I would recommend, studying up on things like that. You think there's a chance you're going to get it in the process, practice it. And so every interview went well. And then the last step was taking a modeling test, which, I went into these interviews. I did my fair share of scratch modeling. I got my hands on a ton of like prior LBO modeling tests, from bankers in my group. But I kind of underestimated how much the time crunch really would be. So it was like a 45-minute, like an hour model. And I just ran out of time because I was like struggling with something like some unique thing in that model, and didn't finish in time. And I think honestly, that's what held me back from getting that offer, which my buddy kind of validated. So I'd say that was a regret, but from then on, like I spent like, all my time prepping for LBO modeling tests, and every other one I took on from there. Absolutely nailed it with like plenty of time to spare. So it became a strength of mine. So yeah, don't underestimate any like aspects of the recruiting process that might come up, and it's better to be over prepared than, under prepared.
Totally. We're going to wrap up this conversation soon, but I wanted to end on one particular thought, and it relates to Adam's question here about, are there any areas you've wished you focused on in banking that prepared you well for private equity? Connor, you have been a top coach for OfficeHours soon after we launched the business. A lot of mentees have loved you. You've placed people into a lot of top firms. I think most recently one at Bain Capital, Double Impact, which is phenomenal. Maybe we can blend Adam's question into this, but how has it been coaching for OfficeHours? What are some kind of tools and know-hows that people have learned through OfficeHours that didn't exist before? And what would you recommend to people who are preparing overall for private equity recruiting?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it's been awesome to see how much OfficeHours has grown over these past, I guess maybe a year and a half is how long I've been coaching. And I feel like call volume continues to be more and more. So I can see you guys are taking on a lot of mentees. And I also, it's awesome to see, some of these guys I work with for a couple of weeks and they have offers. Some it takes a little bit longer, but usually I've seen a lot of these mentees getting multiple offers, and some of them are non-targets like myself, where kind of resonates with me, like what they're trying to do, and then I can kind of guide them in the right direction. Other times they have all the statistics, the undergraduate degree, the working at a top bank, but therefore they're targeting top tier mega funds, like Bain Capital, for example. So it's been cool to work with, a number of different types of profiles, but, what I'd say for the most part is OfficeHours does a great job of kind of aggregating all of the resources you're going to need all in one location through the portal. And then the, highly personalized approach where, if you're a non-target person trying to break into banking and then eventually go from mid-tier bank to private equity, Asif will pair you up with a coach like me who's kind of done that and has that background similar and has experience, placing others from a similar bucket. When I was going through this, I had like a number of different resources to use, some of which I like bought courses from like a random website. I would watch like YouTube videos for modeling, but everything was just like scattered and it was very unorganized and therefore not as efficient. And so I think that's kind of a differentiator for OfficeHours. Everything's centrally located. We're going to get you prepared for whatever it is that comes at you during a recruiting process. And then we're going to pair you up with the right coaches to say, if you have an interview with Bain Capital, we're going to, find a coach that maybe works there or knows someone who works there and replicate the mock interview as close as it possibly can to the real thing. And that's why, we've had so much success there.
Mm-hmm. Totally. No, Connor, we really appreciate your help. Really phenomenal placements. And you do take a lot of time getting to know mentees and helping them on a very personalized basis. And I think that really differentiates you as a coach. So if anyone wants to talk to Connor, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to have some intro calls with him if it's helpful to you all. We are super pumped with where OfficeHours has come over the past 2 years. We're about to hit our 2-year anniversary. So, one-stop shop for all things private equity and buy-side recruiting. All the materials are there, and then we pair you with phenomenal people like Connor. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out. And other than that, happy 4th of July weekend, everyone, and hope people get some time off from work. Thanks for your time.
Look forward to connecting with some of you. And Asif, I appreciate you having me on.
Awesome. Have a good one, everyone.